Mmm, warm apple pie. Warm apple pie with a hint of vanilla, a sort of pie a la mode. In what was arguably the most magical moment of my life, this amazing smell kept my senses, primarily my sense of touch, at bay. Remarkably, however, Angela and I didn't go to prom or any of the other weekend events that everyone plans around the occasion. I approached her from behind in line at the movie theater, and she smiled shyly. I smiled back at her, and we both laughed. While almost everyone else at Comic South High School was at prom, we two misfits walked unaccompanied into the movie theater on a beautiful May evening in 1974. Angela and I had known each other since my family had moved to town 5 years earlier. Officially, I am Nicholas Turkink-Narpsky, and since both of our last names started with a T, I very often sat right behind Angela in the several classes we attended together over the years. During that time, we went from mere acquaintances to pretty good friends and whatever we'd call it. Anyway, she was my first, and I was hers. It is said that the clerks at Ellis Island abbreviated the names of many immigrants when they came to the United States because they couldn't spell or understand them. If that's true, I don't even want to know what my real last name is. I always felt like I should get a 100 on every spelling test just for spelling my last name correctly. Maybe that's why I'm Nikki to my family, but to everyone else who's important in my life, and even those who aren't, I just call myself Trick. Except for Angela. To her, I've always been Nicholas, pronouncing all three syllables rather than blending in two. It was easy to realize that Angela didn't think too highly of me the first year my family lived in town. I was a skinny little 7th grader with a bunch of dark brown, unruly hair. Depending on who you talk to, I was considered either a quirky genius or a lazy slacker, and probably both were true to one degree or another. I could get excellent grades if I wanted to, but I rarely had the opportunity. I was bored to tears in school, and my competitive fervor dulled when I learned how many kids cheated to get good grades. Most of the time, I just showed up to school, kept my mouth shut, and was one of many nameless kids. Angela, on the other hand, was almost my polar opposite. She was incredibly smart, probably the smartest kid in our class, and competed like no one I'd ever met. She was relentless and never let anyone hold her back. She barely tolerated the younger ones asking questions of the teachers, probably because she thought they were inhibiting her learning. At that period of her life, she was also not known for her tact and was very direct with everyone. Someone must have explained to her at one time what tact was, and he or she at least forced her to be tolerant. No one wondered why she didn't have many friends. Angela was not only a force to be reckoned with in the classroom, she was also a force to be reckoned with physically. In 7th grade, she was 5, 8, and towered over almost every other girl in our class. In comparison, my height was 4, 11, and my weight was 68 pounds. Perhaps it was due to the fact that young womanhood wasn't really knocking on my door. I had 2 lessons with Angela in 7th grade, and I'm willing to bet she didn't say more than a dozen words to me all year. This was pretty typical for me, since I was the new kid in school and hardly anyone talked to me. In 8th grade, my social life took off, but my relationship with Angela remained consistently cool. Then, in 9th grade, she would occasionally have a few words with me. I was fine with both, because by this point I had a few good friends and a small social life. But as for dating, well, Angela wasn't dating anyone, because I don't think there was a single guy in our school who had the guts to ask her out. There were rumors in the hallways that she was a lesbian, which was not a good thing in the 1970s. Long Island was a mecca for Italian girls, and in 9th grade, all I could look at was Jennifer Armaroli, a dark-skinned Southern Italian who had the biggest legs on earth and wore short skirts with bare tights to show them off. To quote Bob Seger, she was a black-haired beauty with big dark eyes and her own glasses sitting high, high, very firm and high. My love was only at a distance, because I never had the courage to ask her out. Between freshman and sophomore year, biology smiled on me, and over the summer I grew 5 inches, reaching a height of 5'7" and a weight of 116 pounds. It was like the whole world had rediscovered itself to me, and girls who hadn't paid attention to me before suddenly realized I was alive. Yes, I still had a mop of long, unruly hair, but I was now taller than many of the girls who used to look down on me, literally. Maybe because we were now seeing each other almost eye to eye, Angela seemed much friendlier to me. We had a few deep conversations, and I began to realize that she wasn't an automaton without feelings. In fact, she had quite a few feelings, and I got the feeling that there was a real girl living somewhere inside, just waiting to break free. I tried to talk to her and with her. Sure, she was still the determined Angela, but I was able to see a part of her that I don't think many others saw. A few times we even sat together at lunch and talked. I learned that she wanted to become a heart surgeon and was going to study at Cornell to achieve that. What about me? I was going to be a cab driver. No, I'm kidding. I wanted to be a sports journalist, and I was going to go to the University of Missouri. She told me that she thought I could do better in my life, noting how well I did on state tests and things like that where everyone was on a level playing field. She pointed out that my scores weren't much lower than hers, especially since I didn't spend my precious time studying. We became such good friends that I took her snide comments as an attempt to push me for something more. Somewhere along the line, she eventually succeeded, because I enrolled at Marist College, where I studied to be a transfer student. By my junior year of high school, I was fluent in French and knew all 6 tenses, which is pretty good because most French people only know 4. Italian turned out to be not much more difficult for me. Although Angela didn't have many friends, she was on many committees and participated in many activities throughout her high school years. When one of these groups had a special cause, very often I was her companion. Although we were not couples, this attracted many looks from our peers. In high school, Angela had very infrequent dates. Not that I had a lot of them, but I had more than she did. My senior year of high school, I asked a girl I liked, but hadn't dated yet to prom, and she turned me down. I was disappointed, but not crushed. A few of my friends tried to talk me into taking another friend who really wanted to be at prom, but she wasn't invited. But my heart didn't lie to that, and I told them I wasn't going with just anyone. That's how I ended up at the movie theater alone at prom. Angela and I watched a movie together, and when it ended it was 11, so I asked if she wanted to have a beer with me. It was 18 on alcohol in New York at the time, and there was a bar in town that I had been a regular at since I turned 18, and that's where I took her. I don't think she had ever had a beer, judging by the look on her face during the first few sips, but she took it like a trooper and drank her half of the pitcher I bought. We just talked like normal people, although I noticed she was a little tipsy as she started giggling and stumbling over some words. We were seated 2 at a table of 4, and for some reason it seemed like she was getting closer to me as we talked. I decided that 1 pitcher was enough for the day since I was driving, and after paying the waitress, we both got up to leave. At this point, we were practically standing on top of each other, and I'm not quite sure what possessed me, but I leaned over and kissed her. And the next thing I realized was that I had moved the car to a dark spot in the back of the parking lot, and we both sat in the big, comfy back seat. Again, I didn't quite realize it, but we got down to it. Again, we talked about general things without confessing our boundless love for each other. I think we both realized this was one of life's happy moments and were smart enough to enjoy it. I turned off the engine as I pulled up next to her father's car in the parking lot of the movie theater. Before she could open her car door, I pulled her into my seat, looked her straight in the eye, and said, "Thank you for the gift of you. I will treasure it forever." I realized I had stunned her, and believe me, stunning Angela Tallarico was not easy. Her big eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. Then she got out of the car, got into her car, and drove away. I never told anyone about that night, and I guess she didn't either. I didn't feel like our friendship had changed one bit because of it. For the next few weeks, I thought about that night every day. I knew I didn't love her. I knew she didn't love me. But there was something about her, and I had to see that if I lit a spark in her, it would turn into a flame. The week before graduation, I asked her out on a date that was supposed to be the week after graduation. She gently turned me down, but it hit me. I knew she could tell she hurt me because I'm sure my mouth was open and tears were in my eyes. At 18, most teenagers think they know everything. I, on the other hand, obviously knew nothing. I was shocked. Sure enough, Angela was the valedictorian of the class and, naturally, gave a speech at graduation the following week. I hadn't heard a word of it, nor had I heard any of the other speeches or announcements. I sat next to the class clown, and Mike Lips Laskowitz kept the dialogue going throughout the ceremony. All I did was laugh out loud a few times, and I had a smile on my face the whole time. The ceremony lasted over an hour, and when it was over, my mom asked me why I was the only one who seemed to enjoy the entire ceremony. She knew Lips, and when I pointed out that he was sitting next to me, she said she understood perfectly. "Your father isn't as funny as this guy." "God, what dry speeches," she remarked. Meh. During the summer, I worked at the local library and played softball with a group of high school kids. We had a pretty good team, and it was a pretty good group of guys. We often went out drinking after games, most of which we won. In early August, some of us were leaving for school, so we scheduled a final game for the whole team to attend, and had a final party for both the guys on the team and our girlfriends and cheerleaders. The game was scheduled for late afternoon, and the party was in a friend's big backyard around 8 o'clock. We had defeated a team from neighboring Deer Park 11-0, so we were all excited for the farewell party. When I got there, the party had already been going on for about 10 minutes. I quickly grabbed a beer and walked around the courtyard snacking and saying hello to everyone. Lori Yarnofstein, the girl who turned me down at graduation, was there, and as I approached the small group of people she was with, she turned to me, smiled brightly, and then just kissed me. Lori and I had been friends all through high school, and I always wanted more, but I didn't have the courage to ask her out until prom. She never gave me a reason for turning me down, but I found out from my friends who went to prom that she didn't go either, so it wasn't like I was rejected because of someone else. Lori had shoulder-length golden blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and according to a lot of the guys at Comic South, she was just beautiful. I spent the next hour with her. Then, a disapproving voice came from behind my right shoulder. "Sorry, Lori, but you're sitting in my seat," Angela said, looking at Lori and me. We raised our heads at the same time. Angela was looking at us through the bottom of her glasses. My mouth opened, but no sound came out of it. Lori, stammering, saw the shocked look on my face, quietly got up from the table and walked over to the other group. Just as quietly, Angela moved to the seat Lori had just vacated, and just as naturally put her right arm around me. The conversation, which had been abruptly interrupted when Angela approached the table, resumed as if nothing had happened. "You owe me," she whispered in my ear, "and I intend to collect the debt tonight." I know I blushed 3 shades of red. At the sight of Angela and I, many people looked in our direction with surprised expressions on their faces. I tried my best not to look surprised either. At the end of the night, a few couples were making plans to go bar hopping. When I looked over at Angela, she was already halfway to my car and beckoning me to follow her. "Ah, looks like we have other plans," I said to my best friend Danny and his girlfriend. "Ah, gotta go." "Do you think you can find us a quiet place to park?" she asked in a half-whisper when I saw the lights of the backyard reflected in her dark eyes. "Oh yeah," I muttered as I led her to my car and opened the passenger side door for her. 5 minutes later, I brought us to a nice quiet place and we got down to it. "Why?" I finally asked quietly. "Why did you turn me down for a date before? I thought we had something going on." "We did have something, and it was freaking me out. I didn't know how to deal with it," she replied. "Look, Nicholas, you know that I've already chosen my path in life, and we both know that long-distance relationships in college never end. I didn't want to start something with you only to have it fall apart 6 months later and have you hate me. I really value your friendship, and I don't want to lose it. I don't have many friends, and I really can't lose them. So if we just stay friends?" "Okay, I understand. But why tonight specifically? And what was that crap with Lori?" "Considering she refused to ask you to prom, I felt she had no rights to you, and I wanted to make sure you went out with me tonight. I wanted to send you off to college the right way. But it worked out just fine. Where did you learn everything else? It was wonderful, she purred. Believe it or not, I learned it from reading Penthouse and Playboy, I said. There's a lot more to those magazines than just pictures of naked women. There are words in between those pictures. Huh. Who would have thought it? That should make you very popular in college, she said. After we got dressed and cleaned up, I drove Angela home. I walked to the passenger side of the car, opened the door for her, and helped her out. Goodbye, Dr. Tallarico, I said in my most somber tone. If you ever have any free time at Cornell, why don't you send an old friend a letter? I reached into my car, grabbed a pen and a piece of paper, and scribbled down my college address. Goodbye, Nicholas, she said, put my address in the pocket of her shorts, turned and walked into her house. About a month later, I did receive a letter from Angela telling me about all the interesting things she was doing. About a week later, I wrote back describing my life. A month after that, I received a second letter, which I also replied to, but that was the last letter I was to receive. I realized what she was getting at. I hoped that someday I would just be a pleasant memory for her. Next chapter. Like I said, I've never dated just for quantity. I don't have that kind of ego. I also don't think I need to date the most beautiful girls, at least the prettiest looking ones. Yes, it's a bonus if a woman is as beautiful on the outside as she is on the inside, but I'm really looking for inner beauty. But now I'm back to whining about Angela. The classes were interesting to say the least. Since I was already fluent in French and had a few CLEP credits, my freshman year I chose an easier language and a more challenging one, taking Italian and Chinese. In my sophomore year, I added Spanish and Russian, and then spent a semester in Italy for the first half of my junior year. I spent the second half of my junior year in China. Essentially, I spent my entire junior year off campus. In my senior year, I enrolled in the only French course I could take, the top level, but I found myself a little rusty in the first 2 weeks. We were using a textbook one level lower than the one we used in our senior year of high school. I was doing okay, but I couldn't dominate like I used to, and frankly, I wasn't confident. The professor was a let's get everyone involved kind of person, so I approached her and asked for a courtesy. I'll turn in any work she wants and pass the tests, but I don't want to participate in class discussions for 2 weeks. Then I explained to her I would not only participate, but possibly dominate to the detriment of the rest of the class. I guess Madame Crate was hard of hearing, because for the next 2 weeks she seemed to go out of her way to ask me questions. This annoyed me terribly, and as a result, I remained silent. 2 weeks later, I was summoned to speak to the Dean of Languages, who told me of Madame Crate's complaint. Dean Patrick, I said firmly, have you checked my certificate lately? Is there anyone in this school who has a higher grade point average in the core subjects than I do, and who even comes close to the amount of linguistic diversity that I have? Wouldn't it be a shame if this year's honors faculty member dropped French because of a professor's harassment and made sure everyone found out about it at the banquet? By this point, I was feeling pretty smug. Without another word, I turned around and walked toward the exit and literally knocked over my future wife. Tracy Patrick was the dean's daughter, and she was apparently walking through his door with her lunch from the local bistro when I turned around and walked right over her, knocking the bag of food out of her hands and sending her onto her back. I was about 6 feet tall, and this babe was about 5 feet tall, so I could only see the top of her blonde head when I collided with her. At that moment, I didn't yet know that she was the dean's daughter, but I felt terribly embarrassed for flattening what seemed to be the cutest babe I'd seen on campus. She let out a string of swear words in French, which made me back off from trying to help her up off the floor. Without even thinking about it, I immediately started apologizing to her in perfect French. We then chatted for a bit, also in French, after which the dean introduced the girl as his daughter, a marketing graduate. Apparently, seeing a beautiful girl makes it much easier for you to speak French, he told me in French, with a broad smile on his face. Now take my daughter somewhere nice and apologize to her properly and buy me another sandwich on the way back. This lunch was the first of many we were to experience throughout senior year. It's hard to resist a beautiful woman with an hourglass figure in miniature who can hold a conversation 1 minute and then laugh like a 5-year-old when someone tells a stupid joke. I proposed to her right before graduation. She accepted my ring and became the happiest person on the planet. We scheduled the wedding for the following spring at her home church near Marist. I got a job in human relations with an international firm based in Washington, D.C., and Tracy immediately found a job in her specialty in our nation's capital. We decided to live near D.C. in Virginia. We were close enough to play in the city when we wanted to, but far enough away to be in our own world when we came home. In our first year of independent living, we did all the usual kid things, including a few wonderful weekends when we barely made it out of bed. The woman was practically insatiable in bed, and she just screamed when I brought her to a dozen orgasms as a warm-up. The old saying goes, chance favors the prepared mind. My chance fell right after our wedding the following spring when I was standing in line at Starbucks during my lunch break one day. 2 young executives ahead of me were talking about how their company needed to hire 2 people who understood the business. Finding someone who spoke Spanish would be easy, but finding someone who spoke Russian would be a challenge, they agreed. I knew I shouldn't have listened, but you could make it easy on yourself and just hire me and not hire a second person, I told them. They both looked at me perplexed, and I repeated twice, once in Spanish and once in Russian. What are you drinking? Asked the taller of the 2 men, who turned out to be Assistant Vice President Michael Abrams of 529 Orthopedics, a medical device company. The second man turned out to be the company's chief payroll officer, John Hardacre. The 3 of us sat down at a table, and within 30 minutes, they told me about a new position they could create for me at the company, and that this opportunity could be the career of a lifetime for me. I told them I needed to talk to my wife about it, and we scheduled an interview for 2 days later. It was hard to turn down a job that immediately doubled my handsome salary. The only downside we saw was the occasional travel, but we both agreed that for that kind of money, it was worth it. Moreover, we noted that with proper budgeting, Tracy could be a full-time mom when we had kids in a few years. Within 2 years of joining the company, my role had evolved into a combination of translator, business analyst, information specialist, and kingdom protector, as my immediate boss, CEO Ralph Turner, liked to call me. In a loose sense, I became Mr. Turner's right-hand man, his assistant on many projects. Because I was proficient in 6 languages, to which Arabic was added, I was often involved in high-level negotiations. I was not the official interpreter in these negotiations, but it was my job to make sure that what was being said to Mr. Turner was not twisted. It was kind of a covert role, but there were times when I had to go undercover so as not to disrupt the negotiations. These instances usually resulted in the official 529 interpreter losing his job and the other side sitting at the table in shame. In my 28 years, I was making incredible money and playing an important role in an international company. Tracy stopped working right before the birth of our first son, Joshua, 3 years ago, and 3 months before that she gave me a daughter, Isabel. Tracy was a wonderful mother. She drove the kids to every sporting activity, kept the house in order, became a world-class cook, and volunteered for several non-profit organizations. She was also a wonderful hostess on the few occasions we had guests over. Pregnancy only added about 10 pounds to Tracy, as she was also a gym rat on top of everything else. But those extra pounds seemed to be in all the right places. She had no trouble drawing attention wherever she went, whether she was dressed nicely or in a tracksuit. I had no problem with people staring at her, and she didn't seem to notice the admirers. Even the traveling I sometimes had to do was quite pleasant. Since I was part of the inner circle, I always traveled either business class or first class, and the 529 always put us up in great hotels. Occasionally, a woman would make friendly contact with me in the hotel bar and offer to hook her up for the evening, but I always declined their advances as politely as I could. I was a one-woman man, although it was a nice compliment for a woman to think I wasn't a troll. I still had a mop of unruly hair, though I kept it above my shoulders, and my height was 5'11" at 180. I was also a gym rat. From time to time, when a woman tried to pick me up, I would inquire about her history, especially the married ones. I even talked to some of them who told me their stories, and in most cases, I encouraged them to try to fix things in their marriage. Probably some would call me Dr. Phil in 6 languages. A few years later, we finalized negotiations with a hospital in New York City, and after a great lunch with the 529 team, I headed to the hotel bar, which was mostly dimly lit and empty, for a nightcap with a rye glass or two. Although I didn't turn my head to look, I could tell it was a woman who sat down next to me as I could smell her perfume. "Buy an old friend a drink?" she asked in her direct manner, and I immediately knew it was Angela. "Dr. Tallarico, I presume?" I asked brightly. "I always will." "You remembered. Like I've told you all these years, it's just easier to keep the name, my husband's name." I studied her face in silence, except that she had perhaps seen too much pain and suffering from her patients, or maybe in her own life, as reflected in her eyes, her face was almost exactly as I remembered it. She was dressed for an evening out and looked beautiful. She was still a large woman about 10 years old, but looked a little slimmer than she had in high school, maybe 140 pounds. I took a quick look at it all, and most women wouldn't even realize that I had gotten such a good look at everything. But it was Angela. Nothing could get past Angela. "Did I pass the inspection?" she asked in a cocky voice. She blinked, waiting for an answer. Of course, it was Angela. "Yes," I replied cheekily. We both giggled and sighed. I ordered her a Tanqueray and tonic. Having occasionally talked to old friends, I knew she was an up-and-coming cardiac surgeon destined for a very big career. I expected nothing less. I also knew that her career was more important to her than her personal life, and the proof was in the ring finger of her left hand, despite the slight groove in her skin. "Alone so far?" I asked, lifting my left hand and wiggling my fingers. "Yes, he was a good man. He just couldn't accept that it would take me this long to get things done. I didn't lie to him, just like I didn't lie to you." No, she didn't lie to me. She told me everything straight. "What about you, Nicholas? Are you transferring to the UN or something? A wife and 17 kids?" I told her about how I got a job in a 529 and how it was going. Then I pulled out my phone and showed her pictures of Tracy and the kids. She seemed really happy for me. We had a couple drinks each, then I paid the bartender and said goodnight to her. She leaned over and kissed me gently on the cheek. I reciprocated. We exchanged cell phone numbers, mostly out of courtesy, because I knew she would never have time to return my calls. Tracy went back to work part-time when our second child went to middle school. 6 months after our youngest graduated from high school and left for college, she returned full-time. She worked in the public relations department of a local college, and she seemed to really enjoy her job. Our home life continued as before, except for the new feeling of being empty parents. It took us a while to come to terms with it, but one Sunday we took a trip back in time and almost didn't get out of bed all day. The difference was that this time we were both 46 instead of 20. I have to admit that I slept like a beast that night, and when I went to work the next morning, my muscles ached more than once. "Hey, Grandpa, forgot your cane?" one of the young guys said to me as I limped to the break room for my first cup of morning coffee. A couple years later, Tracy left the university and took a job with a large financial services company that was moving from upstate New York to D.C. Since they were new to the area and she was a veteran, she indicated that she would have a lot of input into some aspects of the company, including things like managing the company's nonprofit expenses. She pointed out to me that she might have to work part-time on some projects, but it wouldn't affect our home life too much. I supported her as best I could and told her to go for it. I didn't pay much attention to it at first, but about a month after Tracy went to work at the financial firm, she started staying late for an hour or two about twice a week, and a couple times she stayed late around 11 p.m. She attributed this to dinners with important clients and/or executives from some of the nonprofit organizations the firm worked with, which made sense given her position. I didn't notice any change in her behavior at home, and she seemed to still be the same loving wife. But every now and then I got the odd feeling like she was trying too hard to be Mrs. Perfect. A few months later, her parents came down from New York to visit. At one point, Tracy and her mother were in the kitchen, and her father and I were in the family room of our house, watching sports and just talking nonstop. How does Tracy like working for Dennis O'Brien? I heard he took over most of the day-to-day work from his father Chuck a few years ago. Good for Chuck. He was a couple years younger than me, if memory serves. So he's about 65, Joe Patrick said. Did Tracy know her boss before she started working for him? I asked nonchalantly, trying not to give away my concern. She never mentioned it. Oh yeah, the O'Briens lived just a few blocks from us when the kids were growing up. Tracy and Dennis were together the last 2 years of high school, even being prom queen and king. For a couple minutes, I thought he was going to be my son-in-law, but he broke up with Tracy a few months after leaving for Michigan State. She was pretty emotional at the time, but you know how it is with kids. I nodded, holding back the rising bile. Tracy and I didn't talk too much about our past love affairs. It didn't concern her, just like mine didn't concern her. But you'd think she'd mention that her new boss was an old acquaintance. I continued to keep my cool, but realized I had to at least reaffirm my trust in my wife. I deftly changed the topic of conversation with Joe, but my brain was suddenly working overtime. I didn't even have time to formulate a plan of action before Tracy and her boss slapped me in the face with their deception, though I'm sure at that moment they didn't even realize what they had done. It was a simple act, played out on a local television program for all to see. I didn't notice it at first, but the beauty of the internet is that what you see on TV never goes away. What a work colleague thought was a good opportunity to watch a replay of my wife's actions on TV turned out to be the worst day of my life. Dennis O'Brien decided it would be a good PR move to throw a raucous fundraiser for the DC Police Department to raise money for new equipment. They called the campaign Love You Blue, probably echoing an old theme used by the Houston Oilers when they were coached by Bum Phillips. O'Brien and Tracy have been working on the promotion for some time now, and the company held a press conference to announce it. I didn't see the press conference, but several of my coworkers did and came into my office to tell me that my wife, along with her boss, had made the noon news. The three of us and them called up the video from the CBS affiliate's website. Tracy spoke first at the podium and then introduced Dennis O'Brien, who walked up to the podium, leaned over to Tracy, put his hands on his forearms, and casually smacked her on the lips. Nothing too demonstrative. Damn! I roared, completely shocking my three coworkers. That goddamn slut bastard is sleeping with my goddamn wife. I'm gonna kill them both. I jumped up from my chair, but my coworkers had the sense not to let me leave the office, despite my threats of physical violence against them. One of them called our security guard, and the other called Mr. Turner, and both of them came running. Mr. Turner was like a second father to me, so when he came into my office and told me to calm down and explain what had happened, I took a few deep breaths and hit the play button on the video. Mr. Turner immediately knew what he was seeing. Holy shit, he muttered. What? Tom Ammerman, who was one of three coworkers in the room, asked, What do you guys see that we don't see? Look at the way they kissed, Tom, explained Mr. Turner gently. No, it wasn't demonstrative. Oh, shit, Tom whispered a little audibly. That's exactly the kind of kiss I give my wife in the morning when I leave for work. There was silence in the room as all 6 men in the office suddenly thought, I'm going to have to take the rest of the day off, Mr. Turner, I finally said to break the silence. I understand, Trick. You've got a lot of days to spare. Don't do anything stupid, son. Before I left, Mr. Turner gave me a business card for a private investigator the firm sometimes employs to do background checks on potential employees. He's not cheap, but he's the best and very discreet. I looked like myself as I walked out of the office in a daze. A look of pity appeared on the faces of Mr. Turner and my coworkers. In a few short weeks, I had gone from being the happiest married man in the world to being suspicious and devastated. How much of this was all a hoax? Had she only married me because she couldn't have him? Maybe there had been others before that? When I walked out of the building, I was literally sick to my stomach. I was angry, hurt, and confused. What had I done wrong to deserve this? On the way home, I called the PI company and made an appointment for the next day. There is no better time than the present to have your heart ripped out. Driving home, I opened my extensive wine cabinet and pulled out a bottle of Jameson's Black Barrel. Tracy arrived around 6, by which time I had managed to drink a third of the bottle of Irish whiskey. She came smiling and cheerful, triumphant after the big fundraiser, but one look from me told her something was wrong. I sat in my favorite La-Z-Boy chair, leaning back, and she came over and leaned over my body, putting her face next to mine, and gently kissed me on the lips, just like she had done to her damn boss a few hours earlier. Her goddamn boss. A comfortable, familiar kiss, a kiss that until today had told me she was mine. All mine. Now, apparently, it was just an empty gesture. It took all my self-control not to shove her off my lap and throw up. "Do you want to talk about it?" she whispered to me. "Do you want to go upstairs and see if I can do it better?" "No, I'll just sit here and drown my sorrows alone." "I don't want to ruin your day," I replied. "From the way you walked in, I'm guessing today was a big PR success for you." "So you didn't see that?" she inquired. "It was a great day for us. Let me grab my tablet and show you the video." "Maybe later. I have a serious problem to solve." We had nothing that night, or for the next week. On the third night, Tracy made a symbolic gesture of initiation, but that was the end of it. It was then that I realized that my loving wife was holding me back, and had been for some time. We used to initiate about equally, but for about the last year or so, if I didn't initiate, I didn't receive. She was constantly responding to my desires to keep me satisfied and unaware that there was a problem. But now that she had a lover, she was more than happy to not have to initiate with me. Not that I doubted it, but after 2 weeks the private investigator had more than enough evidence to prove that my cheating theory was indeed a fact. He had photos and videotapes of 5 different encounters, including one that showed Tracy leaning over his desk in his office in the middle of the workday, time-wise. Apparently, this footage was recorded using the company's internal security system, which means that Dickhead knew what he was filming, and Tracy, I'm guessing, didn't. I didn't bother asking where the investigator got the video. I knew we could never use it in court, but it was another dagger in my heart. Saturday night, I took Tracy out to a nice Italian restaurant that had an atmosphere. While we ate, I told her that I would be out of town Monday through Friday and would be going to New York. I mentioned that since she had been spending a lot of time with Dennis O'Brien lately, maybe she would come to New York with me, and we could turn the trip into a mini vacation to repair the relationship. At this point, Tracy looked up from her plate, but she looked more panicked than surprised by my statement. It was as if she was about to say something, but then changed her mind and lowered her eyes back to her plate. "I can't just pick up and dump Dennis without warning," she said. "Besides being charming and turning on the lights in the morning, I'm not sure he'll be able to run the household without me if I don't get everything ready for him. Yes, I spend a lot of time at the office, Trick, but I don't think I'm neglecting you, am I? Yeah, I guess I've gotten closer to Dennis over the years, but you don't have to worry about him. He's my boss, and you're the love of my life. You're the only man I love, and I'd rather be the only woman you love." Given the information I already had, I realized Tracy was rubbing some bullshit in my face, so I just handed it back to her, putting on what I hoped was my best smile. "Maybe we should get takeout dessert, and we can eat it in bed tonight," I said. She nodded. "Among other things," she whispered back to me. I had loved this woman so much for 24 years, and I knew that even though I was mad as hell at her at the moment, I would always love her in some way. We never made it to dessert. Monday morning, holding myself back, walked out the door and left. I stopped at the grocery store and liquor store to stock up on everything I needed to hide out in one of the scrappiest motels in town for the duration of my proposed trip. I knew I wouldn't be seen by anyone who could let Tracy know I was on this side of town. And while I technically took a week off, I actually managed to get quite a bit of work done by locking myself away for Monday and Tuesday. I guess when I was out of town, the amorous duo didn't go rogue, and my private investigator had nothing to report. On Wednesday, however, they both left the office early and showed up a few minutes later at a swanky, somewhat exclusive Irish pub on the north side of town. After dinner, they drove to Dennis's house in separate cars. At least she had the good sense not to entertain him in our marital bed. My private investigator had alerted me when the gymnastics started, and I knew he was recording too. He made one last call to me around 2 in the morning, telling me that it looked like she would be spending the night with Mr. Wonderful. I set my alarm for 5, and by 7, I was already standing in the middle of Dennis O'Brien's driveway, since apparently he'd asked Tracy to pull into the vacant space in his garage. I was halfway through the morning paper and a second donut when the garage door swung open at 7:30. I guess I could have been a complete moron, but I honked when Tracy started backing up, not expecting anyone in the driveway. She braked sharply, and I saw Dennis slowly climb out of the front seat of his car. I watched them from the front seat of my car. Tracy's eyes popped out of her forehead when she saw me getting out of the car and into the driveway. "Tell me again that I'm the only one you love," I shouted at her. Asswipe didn't look happy as he approached, but then he made the biggest mistake of his life when he told me I couldn't talk to my wife that way. I pounced on him, lowered my shoulder just before contact, and then lifted that shoulder up and without stopping on my feet, flopped him on his back and ended up on top of him myself, executing a perfect takedown. I'm pretty sure I heard ribs crack right before he made a loud "omph" sound. I growled as I pulled away from his prostrate body. Tracy looked at me like I was crazy and then ran up to Dennis as I slowly walked to my car. "You might want to call 911 and don't move him too much so the broken rib doesn't puncture a lung," I hissed to my soon-to-be ex-wife. I saw her mouth move, but no sound came out of it. Her lover was making a lot of noise with an occasional whimper. I got in my car and drove back to the apartment I was staying in. The police showed up at my apartment about an hour later, handcuffed me, and took me to jail for assaulting an idiot. Apparently, O'Brien wasn't too pleased with the pain his broken rib was causing. I used my one phone call, not to alert my lawyer, but to call a reporter friend from the biggest newspaper in town. He found my arrest interesting, and within 2 hours of my call, I was a free man again. Huh? Who would have thought it? An hour after I got back to my apartment, Tracy showed up at my door. "We need to talk, Trick," she said, with the biggest understatement I'd heard in years. I opened the door all the way and gestured for her to come inside. "Why? Just tell me why," I whispered. "I'm not really sure. I still love you, Trick. I really do. It's just that Dennis and I had a history and—" "So you still love him, even after all these years with me?" I cried. "Did you ever really love me? Was I just a poor substitute for him? What about the kids? You just couldn't keep your legs shut, could you?" Emotions ranging from rage to bewilderment raced through my brain. She would never know how close I came to punching her in the face at that moment. She looked at me with pity in her eyes. I knew it was over between us. And I knew that one cracked rib wasn't enough for an asshole. "I'll take care of the filing. Get yourself a lawyer and we can at least act like adults," I said. "Also, make sure that asshole doesn't cross me. I won't be so nice next time." Our week-long presentation in New York was a huge success, and on Saturday night, 529 orthopedics threw a raucous party in the upstairs party room of our hotel. Any worthwhile physician from any hospital in the city, a bunch of hospital administrators, and the upper echelon of 529 were in attendance. I was wondering what one of the most famous cardiac surgeons in the city was doing here when she walked in. Heads turned as Dr. Angela Tallarico entered the room dressed to kill, wearing a black gown. I tensed as I saw her look around, spot me, and head purposefully in my direction. I suppose it could have had something to do with the fact that I hadn't gone on too many dates since my divorce 4 years ago, or it could have been the fact that it was Angela. I was talking to a small group when I spotted her, quickly apologized, and headed straight for her. I gave her a wry smile and then we hugged. There was a strange silence in the room. Bella, beautiful, I whispered in Italian, knowing she remembered the language she had learned in school. She gave me a 10,000-watt smile. Suddenly, I noticed that there were lively conversations going on all around the room. I hope you don't mind me intruding on your orthopedic party, Nicholas, she said flirtatiously. Never, I replied. I'm so glad you stopped by. I directed her to the bar, where I brought each of us a Tanqueray cocktail and tonic. At my request, she told me about the life of one of New York's top heart surgeons. I noticed that she still wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Tell me, is Mr. Tallarico still not in the picture? I asked finally. She hesitated. She cleared her throat. She looked guilty. I don't have time for Mr. Tallarico, if that's what I wanted, which I don't think I do, she said. I've had a few boyfriends since my divorce, but nothing serious. You know what I'm like? Unfortunately, I do. You always let it take over. When are you going to let your heart take over? I did that once before, remember? It didn't end too well for me. Wrong guy. Stuff happens. Get over it, I said. Just like with my wife, although I have to admit that 24 years is a lot more than my 6. I gave her an angry look for a second, puzzled as to how she even knew about my divorce. But then I realized it was Angela. We'd always been brutally honest with each other. Well, almost always. She studied my face for a long moment. I looked deeply into her eyes and was sure I saw what I was looking for. You look beautiful, I said, as we sipped our drinks. You walked in very spectacularly. I'm sure I did. Dr. Angela Tallarico always looks very spectacular. Right now, there are at least a dozen doctors and administrators wondering what the hell I'm doing here. I'm glad you're here. Let me introduce you to someone I think is important. With Angela in my arms, I walked around the premises until I found Ralph Turner. He was one of the few people I told about Angela. So, this is the lovely Dr. Angela Tallarico. I am truly honored, Mr. Turner said in his most courteous manner. Angela blushed. This didn't happen to her very often. Somehow she realized what he meant to me. It turned into a wonderful evening. And then it turned into a wonderful night. Angela didn't hesitate when I suggested we go to our room after the party. What happened next, I think, is obvious. Later that morning, I sent her home in a cab and left for the airport with my 529 team. The flight home wasn't long, but it was enough time for Mr. Turner to sit down next to me and ask how I could let Angela go. For a terribly smart guy, Trick, you're just plain dumb, he said. Marry that woman. Marry her soon. Marry her tomorrow. You know I'm right. He looked me straight in the eye, stood up, and went back to his seat. I knew he was right. The question was, would I ever be able to convince Angela? 2 weeks later, I stood on the doorstep of the house owned by Pasquale Pat and Lorraine Tallarico, Angela's parents. I had never been formally introduced to them, though I had always known of them. I knew they were incredibly important to Angela and the person she had become. They were tough leaders, and I knew that they were the ones who pushed Angela to be as great as she could be. I also remembered Angela saying that they were not impressed with me. That was decades ago, and I hoped I could use them as allies in trying to win their daughter's love and devotion. Angela's heart was a prize worth winning, and in my 50s, I was willing to do anything. I had given up the challenge once, but not the second time. I spent Friday night and Saturday afternoon talking to Angela's parents, explaining how I felt about their daughter and why I believed I could make her happy for the rest of our lives. I talked about everything, even my marriage and divorce from Tracy. I know I surprised her parents when we started talking about finances because I was making about 5 times as much as the esteemed Dr. Tallarico. Just on account of speaking a bunch of languages? Her father asked. Only on account of speaking a bunch of languages with a bunch of CEOs around the world, in a field that's only going to grow, I replied confidently, but modestly as I hoped. We then moved on to a more difficult topic, cracking a nut, which turned out to be their daughter. If you know her well, you know that she is very energetic and very dedicated to her patients. How do you get her to think of herself first? Her father asked. That will be my problem. Just assure me you're on my side, I said. Angela's mother jumped up from the chair she was sitting in and practically smothered me in a hug. While I was trying to catch my breath, Pat grabbed my hand and wished me happy fate. I figured that meant I had their blessing. I made a date with Angela 2 weeks ahead of time and planned a long weekend with Ralph. I had her dressed to the hilt and showed up at Angela's house on Friday night with a corsage around her wrist. I then escorted her to my rented limo, and we headed to East Meadow on Long Island to Borelli's, my favorite Italian restaurant. Borelli's restaurant was still old-fashioned enough that I could ask for an Italian-speaking waiter, and he had to speak only Italian at our table all evening. Being Italian and having studied the language in school, Angela could speak and understand some of what was being said, but the waiter and I were moving too fast for her to keep up, so I was ordering for her and generally being the go-between. We didn't even hold back when the manager came out and greeted me in Italian, like I was his long-lost brother. After that, we drove back into town where I had a reservation at one of the upscale dance clubs. As soon as we entered the club, it came to her that she was blushing. "It's prom night, isn't it?" she exclaimed. "Prom night is for losers," I replied. "Remember, some of us were too busy going to the movies to make it to prom." We laughed like a couple of idiots and then went dancing the night away. When we pulled up to her house around 2 in the morning, I walked her to the door and then, very formally, told her I had a great time. "Why don't you send the limo home for the night?" she wheezed. She didn't need to be told twice. After a few dozen minutes, I asked, "Ang," no one ever called her Angie or lived up to it, "have you ever thought about how you want to spend your retirement years?" "Honestly, no, Nicholas," she replied. "I've got some good years ahead of me, so no, I haven't thought about it. Besides, you know I'm not very good at multitasking." I was hoping for something better. Damn, I'm not persistent after all. "Okay, but we still need to get moving. Graduation weekend is far from over," I said. "Matt, are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked. "Oh yeah, there's still a lot to do, lady," I replied. I grabbed my bag of clothes, and the next day we went about our usual routine. Lunch, some shopping, dinner, then a Broadway play, followed by drinks at another nice restaurant. We spent the night in my hotel room doing the same things we had done the night before. But this time we went to bed a little earlier because I told her I had a special breakfast planned on the island. We were both a little tired when we got up at 7. At 8, we were already sitting in my rental car and driving down the Long Island Expressway, which was pretty empty on a Sunday. As I turned off the LI and headed towards Comac, an amused expression appeared on Angela's face as she realized what was up. Her parents were waiting for us on the front porch when we pulled up. Her parents greeted me like I was a long-lost son, but I whispered to her mother that Angela wasn't thrilled about the marriage as we hugged. She was surprised, but told me to hang in there. For her part, Angela looked shocked at the way her parents greeted me. We started with fresh pastries that I had asked her parents to buy from a local bakery, but after that, it was Angela's mom who took over the culinary delights. We ate like kings, and the conversation revolved around Angela and her childhood. There was a lot of laughter around the table. We finished the smoky mimosas, and it wasn't until she finished her flute that she discovered there was something stuck in the bottom of her flute. That's where I'd stuck the 3-carat yellow gold engagement ring I'd had specially made for me at Tiffany & Company. "Nicholas, no. You didn't," she whispered hoarsely, bursting into tears. I can't accept it." "You can accept it," her mother said in a scolding tone, then grinned widely. "It's time for Dr. Tallarico to become Dr. Tallarico Trick. Oh, hell, never mind. Angela, I'm not trying to take away from what you've done to get where you are, but there's more to life than just a job. Look at your parents. They've been married for 50 years, and they still look like they love each other very much. Don't you love the time we spend together?" "I do. And I want to wake up with you every morning and know that we'll be together every day." And then the unthinkable happened. Angela started crying and then sobbing. I hugged her, and when her mother held out the dried ring to me, I gently pushed her away and then put it on her finger. She looked at her hand as if she had never seen her fingers before. With Mr. Turner's approval, I changed my 529 status to consultant and moved out of New York. Angela and I bought a nice house in the country, and a year later we were married. My children were happy for me, although both thought Angela was a bit stuffy. Admittedly, Angela was reserved with my children. She didn't have children of her own, and I knew it wasn't her policy in those days to have children. But when my children had children of their own, restraint became a thing of the past. She may not have wanted to be a mom, but her grandmother's genes were huge. Okay, ridiculous would be more accurate. It gave her a huge advantage over her children, and they were able to bond strongly. Grandkids were the only reason we dated my ex and husband #2 Dennis. We were never the best of friends, but we managed to be civil, especially around kids and grandkids. Dennis was still a little mad at me since he never forgave me for breaking his rib, but he should have known I could have done more and really messed up his life. He certainly deserved it. Waking up next to Angela every morning is a pleasure. Our life together is good, although sometimes she still gets a little carried away with her work. It's understandable given what she does, but at times like that I give her a day or two of respite and then bring her back. She always apologizes for snapping, and we usually spend the whole weekend in bed, although in our 50s, we don't do it the way 20-year-olds do. Most of that time we just lie in bed, cuddled up, and talk about everything and nothing. We are best friends, lovers, spouses. We both plan to retire at 60 and travel the world a lot. Maybe I should learn a 7th language. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.